Once upon a time, wrestling went to the extreme. And it was good. It was damn good. But one day the music stopped, leaving an extreme hole in the hearts of many ECW fans everywhere. Now sure, there may have been a one-night stand afterwards, but things would never be the same again. And sadly, some fans even turned to doing the worst thing a jilted lover can do after a bad breakup. Find someone who reminds them of their ex. Because in the end, all they're gonna do is disappoint you. Which was definitely the case with the WWE's ECW. But did it have to be this way? Well, in this episode, not only are we going to take a look at the possibility of WWE's ECW actually being good, but also just how good it could have been and how close we could have been to that actually being a reality. Because today, Dave knows what if WWE's ECW was actually good. To tell the story of what could have been, let's pick a branching off point for this alternate timeline. So to be clear, I'm working with the idea that the invasion angle and all that awfulness still happened. I already did a video looking at what if that was erased from history. However, today we'll be following the events immediately after the original ECW One Night Stand in 2005. So now that we have that established, let's discuss a few things that the WWE actually did right. First, Paul Heyman coming on board was key, but as we can see, Paul E doesn't guarantee success just by being there. He definitely needed a little bit of help in certain areas and a lot less restrictions in others. But personally speaking, I don't think anything calling itself ECW at the time could ever have thrived without Heyman at the helm. Additionally, Joey Styles had to return as the voice of ECW. And lastly, the fact that valuable ECW alumni were already employed with the company was a big plus too. Which leads me to my next point. Rob Van Dam being the ECW World Champion to usher in the new Extreme Championship Wrestling on the WWE was the only way things could ever go down. Now sure, many fans did not like subsequent one-night stand pay-per-views, including the second one where RVD cashed in Money in the Bank against John Cena. And also some fans will even argue that RVD made the TV title more important than the world title itself, and therefore a world title run just wasn't necessary. But I have to disagree with that. Yes, RVD's epic run with the television strap did overshadow the world belt, but that doesn't make him exempt from the world title picture in all cases. And yes, it was great that he elevated a mid-card belt into the main event status, but the new ECW definitely needed RVD to be the face of the company. He was a new world champion for this new iteration of ECW, but at the same time he was also a familiar face. If they had put a new young outsider as champion in this nostalgia-based company right off the bat, well, that would have just aggravated many fans. And in terms of ECW alum, no one was more over than Rob Van Dam. And having him win the WWE's title as his way of bringing back the ECW World Championship was a brilliant move, adding more to the ECW title than if it was just simply handed to him. And winning it off of John Cena, the guy who many ECW fans felt represented what was wrong with wrestling at the time, was a very serendipitous moment indeed. But that's where the good times stop, because WWE has a habit of destroying things that they don't understand and didn't develop. Which definitely means that WWE ECW definitely started at a deficit. So what should have happened? As far as I'm concerned, RVD should have pulled a Shane Douglas, throwing the WWE belt down and telling them that they can all kiss his ass. After dismissing the WWE World title, the WWE could then reclaim their belt just like the NWA did. And now the WWE Championship and the ECW Championship would officially be separated. Now I know, WWE would never do this, but I'm just saying that's how things should have happened. Unfortunately, what actually happened, RVD held on to both belts, eventually losing only the WWE title but still having the ECW Championship only because it wasn't on the line. This just made the ECW's top prize look weak. Next, ECW also needed to keep big-name WWE talent out. Bobby Lashley, Kurt Angle, and even to some extent Chris Benoit all should have stayed away. And well, yes, I know that both Benoit and to a very limited degree Kurt Angle both had ties to the original ECW. The reality is, they're just not all that associated with the brand. ECW needed to stand on its own as much as possible. Also, quality new talent was much needed. The zombie and vampire gimmicks were awful from conception and only stole airtime away from those who really needed it. Less developed wrestlers that fit the ECW motif, like CM Punk, were great additions, but they weren't utilized as effectively as they could have been. And on top of that, there weren't enough of them either. ECW was always the perfect proving grounds for talent that didn't fit the mainstream mold. The wrestling business has always had, and will always have, people who are talented, have a dream, but would never look like Randy Orton or be able to talk like The Rock or just don't have that compliant nature that Vince McMahon requires. ECW was the sanctuary for those kind of people, and it should have been once again. And finally, Sci-Fi was not the right place to air this show, and also large arenas were not the right venue. This was just the WWE standard formula. Now, it may have worked on a certain level to keep the WWE ECW going for a while, but it was not the direction that true ECW fans wanted, nor was it as successful as it could have been. So now, how could things have actually been good, and was that even a possibility? Well, the answer is yes, it was, and you know what? We were really close to it actually happening. Shane McMahon always had his eye on ECW, knowing a good thing when he sees it, just like UFC. Shane almost bought ECW himself when the company was on its last legs, and he wanted to keep it alive. If that happened, ECW might still be around today, and if it was, the entire landscape of wrestling would have been radically different. For example, Ring of Honor may never have formed. RF Video, the distributor for ECW, noticed that they had a huge loss of profits after ECW folded. So to replace this income, they decided to create their own wrestling promotion to fill the void, Ring of Honor. If Shane had bought ECW right away and kept all of their connections and just ran it as its own company, not affiliated with WWF, we may never have gotten ROH at all. Also, an edgy alternative could have been a great contrast to the polarizing PG era of the WWE today. In fact, if ECW was still a contender, there's a chance that WWE may never even have switched to the PG era in the first place. They might have just stayed with an Attitude-esque persona in order to compete with their rival. Now, this also won't be the last of Shane O'Mac and ECW. After the success of the first One Night Stand, Shane actually wanted to take control of ECW yet again. He was denied by Vince again, and this probably, in part, led to his departure from the WWE. Now, at this point, Shane's plan for Extreme Championship Wrestling was to make an internet-based wrestling show. Shane, being the innovator that he was, knew the potential both things had, especially together. Now, what's important to note here is the actual events that would unfold for the WWE just a few years later. Now, do me a favor, just imagine a rebranded wrestling promotion that made use of both non-traditional established talent as well as young up-and-coming talent, performing in contrast to the mainstream and played in small venues for a local crowd over streaming internet service. Well, you don't have to really imagine it, because I'm talking about NXT. ECW had many spiritual successors who carried the torch as best as they could in wake of the Extreme absence. Ring of Honor in many ways embodies a lot of what made ECW great. The humor of Chikara has a hint of ECW's parody mentality, and continuing with the violent aspects, although I think they go a bit too far, CZW has been quenching bloodlust since 1999 and picked up the slack after ECW went under. But none of these companies better represent what ECW almost was for the WWE, like NXT. If the new ECW had played in Philadelphia exclusively from the beginning, much in the same way that NXT calls Florida home, the promotion could have gotten off on the right foot. Also, like NXT, ECW works best with smaller, more intimate crowds that can really be part of the action. It seems quite clear that Shane's initial plan for ECW was the groundwork in which Triple H would adopt for NXT. And as far as I'm concerned, the original ECW showed promotions that less can be more sometimes, and how to best utilize the Heyman principle of celebrating what you do have and devaluing what you don't. Furthermore, many will note how Ring of Honor's rougher style and use of wrestlers like Tyler Black, Kevin Steen, and El Generico is the exact kind of thing that Paul E would have done if ECW was still around. And it's no surprise that all those guys were also in NXT. And finally, I know the big glaring hole in this theory for many people is, what about the violence? Well, truth be told, hardcore wrestling is a term that has been corrupted over time. ECW really put the term hardcore over, but so many people have forgotten what it meant back then. Hardcore in ECW meant hardworking, dedicated to fans, and devotion to the craft of wrestling by any means necessary. Yes, sometimes that meant taking a pizza cutter or a stop sign or a cheese grater to the face, but that's not all there was to it. Let's not forget wrestlers like Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Chris Candido all made huge impacts in Philly. Also, ECW helped to usher in Lucha Libre and Japanese wrestling into the 90s. ECW was so much more than just tables, ladders, and chairs. It was a principle that is not as prevalent today as it should be. But yes, I do agree to some extent with the kind of people who watch Walking Dead just for the zombies that properly done, extreme violence is a must for ECW, at least on occasion. And this was one thing that WWE's ECW sorely lacked. ECW did violence right, and many have struggled to replicate it. No one wants slapstick cookie sheet matches, and there's no way that combat zone style violence would ever make it on air. But a middle ground was most desirable. Now, certain sponsors, especially during the PG era, tend to stay away from associating with more adult levels of content. But WWE does still occasionally draw blood. Kelly Kelly was originally introduced as an exhibitionist, and if the content was exclusive on the network, like where all ECW content currently is, then everything would have been just fine. And the new ECW would have actually been done right. So what would things have been like if the WWE's ECW was actually good? Well, Paul Heyman probably would have remained employed with the brand, Shane McMahon McMahon might never have left in the first place, and NXT would probably be a lot like it is now, except it would be wearing an Extreme mask instead of the WCW one that Triple H is making it wear. Well, there you go, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments what you think things would have been like if WWE's ECW had actually been good. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up. Thanks again for watching, and this has been Dave Knows.